even before we met in San Antonio at the ICPA conference, you and I were emailing because the theme of the conference was Western theme, and I had no idea what exactly that meant. I didn't want to be the only non-participator, but I didn't want to get it wrong altogether.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
On LinkedIn, and as far as connect with us and whatnot, that's one of the things that is we're looking at. We've had some people start contacting us about advertising with us, so that's a good thing. So I guess we're hitting a niche, so this is good. But that all said, Lalo, how you doing, my friend? It's another good morning for recording here, so I'm looking forward to today's show.
It is, and I'm really excited that this will be our first. I was going to say our first international guest, but it's not, because we had some people from Mexico come on before, but we do have our first across the pond, I guess, across North America. It's not in the same continent, at least. And so this is our first one.
Remember now, Anik is over in Germany, so it's kind of one of those. She's not a guest; she's been a facilitator, so that's and a co-host, I guess.
That's true. Yeah. Right. Okay. Guest. Let's. She's
a host, true first across the pond guest for us.
Yeah. Exactly. So we met Fiona back in San Antonio during the ICPA conference in.
No, it was Oklahoma, wasn't it?
No. In San Antonio. San Antonio.
Okay.
Yeah. For the ICPA.
My permitter's not going all the way up here. I don't know.
So yeah, we met her in San Antonio and. Got to learn a little bit about her business out in Ireland and in Dublin, and it was really fun to learn because it was like, I'm not going to say an exact mirror of Global Training Center, but pretty much similar. Her company does training for EU trade and customs out in the EU, which is something that we have always tried to do and have been trying to do, but. Now that we know somebody else is doing it and we can probably partner, might make it a lot easier instead of having to open and exactly, instead of opening up and creating a whole new entity out there, which I'm not really keen to that right now. But anyway, I guess, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, let me just jump in for our listeners. Let me tell you what you're going to do. We're going to be getting to talk about something here where you may have some folks in your company, either yourself or some others here in the States or over in Europe or whatever, that is needing some specific, import, export, compliance related, transportation related, all those kinds of things, training. So that's where the perspective you need to look at. This is going to be a phenomenal discussion because this lady is unreal. But Lalo, why don't you bring her, formally introduce Fiona?
Sure. So Fiona Luciani, and I hope I didn't mess that up, but Fiona Luciani from Dublin. She's in Dublin, Ireland, and her company is ITC. And they pretty much... Like I said, they do training for EU trade customs compliance. They do a little differently than what maybe we do or a lot of different companies here in the States do. They do more of a cohort, kind of like almost like a university college setting, not setting, but type environment where you go for a semester or a term. It's not really literally a semester, but a term, or and they continue that process and build on the courses, but we'll let her explain a little more about that. So Fiona, welcome to our show.
Thanks a million. It's so lovely to be here. You've no idea. Even before we met in San Antonio at the ICPA conference, you and I were emailing because the theme of the conference was Western theme, and I had no idea what exactly that meant. So I didn't want to be the only non-participator, but I didn't want to get it wrong altogether. So I was emailing you and said, like, what, like, is it serious? Is it strict? And you were like, relax, it's fine. It's a bit of fun. And my gosh, it was such fun. And I certainly met so many people, individuals and businesses, which was so great because, look, we're just coming out of the pandemic, out of COVID, where we weren't allowed to get out and about and we weren't allowed to get face-to-face talking to people. And I think, look, nothing beats being in the same room with folks that are thinking the same, that want to learn, that want to network, and basically want to progress in their own professional development. So, so that was back in September, I think, the middle of September, and then since then we've been back and forth, and so it's just lovely to be here with you both today.
Well, we might have an opportunity. I don't know if ICPA does themes in the EU, but ICPA for their EU conference in 2024 will be in, lo and behold, guess where? Dublin, Ireland.
I'm so happy about that. I think it's April, the end of April next year. So I don't know. I was searching back on their previous events and their website to see if they had a themed event on their European side. And I couldn't find one. I definitely found the difference over in the US. So, but look, it's great fun and everybody's on the same page. And so I was just worried in advance of that, like, am I going to get it right or get it wrong?
Okay, so with this, let me ask you this, is that with what you saw before we start getting into some things with your company, because you have a fascinating company and some of the credentials I love. But when you came over to ICPA in the summer, or in the fall, excuse me, in September, what was your impression overall as we were getting together and all that? Did you see, or do you see a difference of the way some Americans approaching, the training and need for training, or is it very similar to that of the way Europeans are looking at things?
I think there's so many similarities in both approaches. So the trouble is, and the tricky bit that we're trying to overcome, is to try and communicate with those that don't put their hands up and say, I need training, I need support, I need professional development in, say, how to classify my products or rules of origin or whatnot. So even though it's so great to go to these events like ICPA or even like a virtual online event, you're kind of talking to those that have identified themselves as, I need to upskill, which I think is pretty brilliant. By the way, like on our program, I hesitate to call the participants students, because these trade professionals are top of their game in some cases, where they are on it and they know what they're talking about, but there's something about them that they're able to put their hand up and say, I want to get better, even better. And that's why, I want to come along and do your program, and maybe we can talk about that again. And what, why do they identify themselves as somebody who wants to upscale, or, that whole aspect of professional development. And so, like, that's so important for some people. And we talk to our participants a lot, all the time. Like, why are you doing this training? Why are you doing this program? And so it's always interesting to me to get to the bottom of why people are putting themselves forward into a position where there's a lot of time commitment as well doing these programs, financial commitment, of course, doing these programs. And so it's so great, like, to when they come to the end of that program and they do their final exam, and you can celebrate with them, and you can see their career progression, and you can see, from now and again, they'll come back to you and write you a note to say, like, I got that job that I wanted, or I got that promotion that I was looking for. And it's fantastic. And
doesn't that make you feel good when you see that kind of stuff, and you have, yes.
Yeah.
You strut around like a peacock in the barnyard. It's like, oh, that is so good.
I know. And it's so it's easy from where I stand. Like, I'm sitting behind a computer screen going, this is what you need to learn, and this is what you need to go and do. It's these folks that have to go away and do it, and they do it so well. So, but anyway, the differences would be around, like, there's so many similarities, in terms of, like, we're part of this network, this trade compliance network of people, and there's various groups on LinkedIn, and there's the ICPA, and there's various groups here in Europe as well. And so I think the challenge is to try and communicate with those who don't know about the supports that are out there, and don't know that, you don't have to struggle in say the role that you're doing, and there are supports out there. Yeah.
And there's a couple of things I wanted to clarify, and I want to apologize. I said ITC, it's actually ITI, International Trade Institute, and I apologize for that. I'm sorry, Fiona, but I also want to make a point. I like what you said, that you have seasoned professionals also attending, but I usually make that comparison ourselves, for our business, is that even CPAs and attorneys that have been in the business for decades even attend yearly training, because they do need to be updated and they do need to understand anything that's going on. And what I usually tell people, and this might be the case with you also, Fiona, is that in the time that it takes you to research and look for and find the correct information that you need for X, any one issue or compliance concern, I mean, let alone many of them, in that time that it takes you to do that, you would have already had taken our class. And because we filtered through all that, and I'm sure you all do too. And it's a lot. You get all the better information instead of having to filter through all of that information. Well, which is right, which is wrong, et cetera, et cetera. So
I know, like, there's one particular person that comes to mind that participated on one of our programs in the early days. And he was that guy that had all of the books, all of the academic research papers and all of that. And he was kind of like, gosh, it just takes me so long to get through all of that. And so it is better or nice to have dedicated day to a training session and get through it. But also, which I love, is that not only do you learn from that educator or that expert in the room or in the virtual room, it's so nice to see when you've got this peer-to-peer learning aspect, so that you're learning from somebody else who's been there, and then you could teach somebody else who's coming up with a problem or an obstacle that you've already faced and you've already overcome. And it's just magical to see all of that coming together in a room over the course of a day. Or you mentioned our program is it's like kind of a cohort, like it's over the course of 7 weeks. So, and you're getting to know and increase your professional network and all of those things that are just so important when you're trying to get on with your job and you're trying to get on with the work that you have to do. And we're all busy, and after our work, we've got our personal lives and loads of distractions happening there too. So yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, for our listeners, why don't you stop for a second here and actually explain your program? Because I thought it was just it's really fascinating. I think you've got a phenomenal benchmark that I think would be phenomenal for us to phenomenal. Listen to me, I'm like repeating myself here. Sorry, folks. Would you explain your program and let people know what you've got? Because I think it ought to be replicated, quite frankly. But anyway. Here in the States.
Thanks a million. So essentially, so my background has always been in training and education. And over the course of the last 10, 15 years or so, we put together these kind of 1 day, half-day sessions on customs, half-day sessions on classification. And so as time went on, we got an overwhelming request for a more comprehensive program that covers all aspects of customs and trade compliance. So the program that the ITI offers is based off the EU Customs Competency Framework. And it actually sets out 7 modules, 3 of which are classification, valuation, origin. The other one is around supply chain operations, prohibitions and restrictions, and then sort of an introduction to customs. What is customs? And so it's based on customs law, essentially, but from an EU point of view. So when we started in September 2021, we started in Ireland simply because that's where we're based. And very quick, which was brilliant. And like the IDA, which is the government agency that attracts foreign direct investment into Ireland, does an amazing job. And you can see who's here in terms of multinational companies, in terms of American companies. We've got a massive medtech ecosystem on the west coast of Ireland. And then we've got tech, the likes of Intel, IBM, and Google, all of these companies here. So it was a really great place to start. And also that's where we're based. But very quickly, we realized that actually there's trade professionals outside of Ireland and outside of the EU that are looking for this. So we saw a jump in, I guess, inbound inquiries and also in actual participants on the program from countries in the EU, which of course the curriculum is aligned to the EU customs law, but also outside of the EU, from companies and trade professionals in those companies that trade with the EU. And so, and even with that, you can see some huge differences. And so that's another really nice aspect, I think, when you have somebody from the EU communicating with somebody from outside the US, for instance, and they get to know, okay, what are your problems? Do you see the EU as, 27 different countries or 27 different member states? That's almost like a jigsaw puzzle making up these countries. And these countries have different cultures, different languages, in some cases, different currencies in some cases. And so just to get that understanding of that's what we're dealing with when we're dealing with international trade. And so, and then of course, from a legal point of view, that each member state interprets the law in its own way. So it's really nice for folks outside of the EU to just get a kind of a general overview and an understanding of that as a step one. And of course, then we're working very closely as traders with our freight forwarders. But it's to get an understanding of, we're working with CEVA Logistics, DHL Global Forwarding, Expeditors, any of these, Schenker, any of these companies. But what exactly are these companies doing for us? And because ultimately, I guess, as a trader or as a manufacturer, you're responsible for that. So all sorts of issues come up. And I actually did a little survey with our participants who've been on this program and asked them what are your top concerns when it comes to international trade with outside the EU, and it came back as Incoterms, commercial invoice. I know, sure, yeah, I wasn't surprised with it, but at the same time, to document something like that and then be able to say, right, well, that's easily solved. It's communications and it's agreements and of course negotiations. And I'm not trying to simplify it, but.
Well, you have to. I got to tell you, I'm going to challenge on that statement because that's what we need to do. The problem is that the mystique of international trade, as you start going through it and you start throwing out the terms, hence Incoterms. If you don't know that, folks, that's international terms of international commercial terms of sale. Excuse me. And with that is that it's like who is responsible basically on those Incoterms. That 3-letter code can tell somebody the shipper's responsible for these things, the buyer's or the consignee's responsible for these things, the importer these things, and whatever. When risk transfers from one to the other, not necessarily ownership transfers, but when risk transfers. All that kind of stuff. And you need to understand how that works and what the implications are behind that. Because let's say, again, X works is one that it's like, okay, the buyer's responsible, the seller puts it on the dock and it's now the buyer's responsibility all the way through. Well, what does that mean? And you go through all that. So I will say you've got to break that down into more layman terms in a sense of what does it mean so people can relate to it. And I'm not talking just compliance. I'm talking the senior executives of a company or the shipping folks or the purchasing or the accounting or the sales and all that comes into play. You got to have the training to be able to explain those kinds of things and see what's going on. But here's the other thing. Having the proper training for that will also show how that paperwork should be filled out, including the bill of lading on whatever mode you're transporting, who should be paying the shipping charges or transportation charges, let's say that, who should be paying for the duties and taxes and responsible for the clearance, who should be, what the descriptions are, what should be synchronized between the bill of lading and the commercial invoice and those kinds of things. So as complex as all that kind of stuff is, I will say, no, we need to simplify it because I can tell you, folks like me are dumb as a box of rocks. So I got to keep it simple. You got to draw me pictures there, Fiona.
I know. We had a class this week on rules of origin, and the teacher, Laura Beretta, she's amazing. And she's like, I'm just trying to help you get out of the Amazon rainforest in your bare feet. She's like, it's a complicated labyrinth of rules and regulations that we're trying to navigate. And I'm just trying to help you here. And she was able to break down those like laws and the legal regulations and all of that theory is so important to know. But what does it actually mean to me? What does it mean to me in my job when I'm trying to get my product from A to B, with a forwarder in the middle trying to help me, and then who's a customs clearance agent on the other side who's doing that, and so it's back to those international commercial terms, Incoterms. And so I smiled because I thought to myself, my gosh, like she's right. Like that's what we're trying to, is like demystify what's involved in international trade, but also to acknowledge that, you know, it is complex in some cases. And when you're going, you know, trading domestically and trading internationally is other level. And so if you get the right partner, and that's why it's back to kind of, you know, who's your forwarder? Do you have a forwarder? And what do they do for you? And
so here's something that what I'm hearing from your program is that, because I want to take it full circle here, is that, all right, so you've got a program that provides training that is all encompassing based on you're saying the EU standards and what should be included in that. So if you go through and you have all these different courses that you've laid out, I take all of that. One of the things that you've not mentioned to me is the credential. What do I get if I complete all these courses and all that with your program?
So it's back to those early days when we went out to the market and said, okay, so if we put this program together, what do you want it to look like at the end of it? And so we've aligned ourselves with a university in Scotland called Glasgow Caledonian University. So you get a university credit rated certificate at the end of this 7-week program, where you can pin it up on your wall or share it on LinkedIn or do whatever it is that you wanted to do with it. And do you know what I found was those that take this program, like in some cases, they may have 20, 25 years experience in industry. And I'll say to them, my gosh, you could almost deliver this program. Why are you doing it? And they say, well, because I want that academic recognition behind.
You want the credentials so you can show people. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. And so in Europe, it's like a level 6 on the Irish framework of qualifications. I'm still trying to figure out what the US equivalent is, but it's like it's a practical professional qualification. So, and it's university recognized, which I think it's important. But at the end of the day, what we find is more important is the practical information. Can I apply what I learn to my job? And
all right, with that, I'm going to shift gears here a little bit. And this actually is going to be a question for Lalo and yourself, Fiona. And that is, when y'all were you obviously are two very intellectual colleagues here and whatnot. And I enjoyed sitting back watching y'all having conversations and whatnot. But in doing so, when we were at the conference there in San Antonio, and getting into talking, of course, you've had more correspondence since then. But have you found yourself, the old adage here in the U.S., there's iron sharpens iron, right? And so the scenario, have you found yourself where you have maybe challenged each other in the way you're looking at your own businesses here as far as trying to provide training for, like the Global Training Center and the International Training Institute? Have you been able to help each other and maybe stimulate some thought on whatnot and sharpen your skills with each other from just being in similar or the same industry?
I haven't reached out as far as the EU portion of it. It's more like it's more like collaborating in the sense that I know that we feel there is a synergy there that I know that we can we get clients, like, for example, big companies that, like Unilever, GE, all these big companies that have EU operations that come to us and they'll say, "Can you do EU?" And we try to scrounge up and look through our network to see who we can have that can do the training in the EU. Most of the time, we just turn down the business. And in our case, yeah, I would love to, and it's better to just have someone like a Fiona out there that we can say, you should go to this training and you should do this and talk to them. And I know she's done that as well. I've gotten a couple of references that say that they came through the ITS or ITI. I'm sorry, references, and so I guess they have the same thing. I want to understand U.S. customs and they want to attend our training.
Yeah. And from our point of view, there's a huge difference. From our point of view, I'm always intrigued at what other people are doing, what other companies are doing, but more importantly, what other education providers are doing, and how we can be best in class and how we can continue to improve what we're doing. We only focus on EU customs, and so it's really nice to know Global Training Centre, and so that we can put people in touch. But what we don't have over in the EU, and from an Irish point of view, is the customs license, the customs broker license. So that was a huge difference that I very quickly began to learn about when I went to the US or spoke to companies and professionals in the US, and that's the huge difference. And so I know you offer training in this regard, and we don't even have it as an option. Yeah.
And what's the difference with that? I mean, can an individual go in the EU or Ireland? I guess EU. Oh God, how does that work? Okay, so if you're licensed for your country and not necessarily for the whole EU, correct?
So we don't have the license at all. There's no license.
No,
you can be a
no broker licenses.
Yeah, I could. You don't need
so here's the question, because this is where it comes in, because a customs broker is trained to be able to prepare and submit an entry here in the U.S. on behalf of the importer. So in relevant terms, when an entry is prepared and submitted, let's say to Ireland customs there, obviously it's EU clearance, but in that, is it just any individual kind of thing, or is it an individual from the company? And how is there a bond tied to that, or that the customs says, okay, yeah, I'll trust your word, or do you have to pay for your duties and taxes right at that time? How's that work for us? For you, excuse me.
Yeah, so you can be a customs clearance agent with zero qualifications here. Yeah, and I know it's so for me that was totally normal until I realized. I know it's not just the US. There's other trading blocks and countries that are similar, but you can either outsource it, so you can do it internally. And what happened? Not that we want to go into Brexit too much, but Brexit for us, particularly from Ireland, because of it from a geographical point of view, where Ireland, UK, and the rest of the Europe was. We used to use the UK, and you still can use the UK as a land bridge, and you didn't have to make any sort of customs declarations. But now in Ireland, what we see happening is the amount of customs declarations submitted into the customs authorities has massively increased, because we have to go through the UK, which is now a third country, of course. And so same for the US. So yeah, you can. So there was a point in time, and still is, where there was a lack of customs clearance agents compared to the amount of declarations that needed to be submitted. And so Revenue are now going back and having a look at those at the accuracy of those declarations that were submitted. But yes, you can, I bet a lot of the big forwarders, 3PLs and 4PLs can do this for you,
So let me come back though, is that if I submit an entry for my company there in Ireland, is there a customs bond, if you will, for that entry? Or do I have to pay the duties and taxes at that same time? do you submit the entry and then pay customs, 10 days later, 5 days later, whatever, or what?
I think it's different in depending on different situations. So you could have a custom simplification in place where you have a monthly account with revenue, and you submit your declarations, and then they take out the duty that was owed, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, we've seen penalties. We've seen people going to jail for misdeclarations, and as a company director, as a company owner, you're responsible for that at the end of the day, even if you do outsource it to somebody else. There are bonds. I mean, there's AEO, authorized economic operator, which is kind of like the CTPAT in the US, where essentially customs or the revenue authorities will trust you a little bit more, and there are bonds in place in that for those traders, but not for everybody.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, where as far as the current scenario now, I mean, training, you're constantly trying to keep up with the different changes and things of that nature. So what's happening right now? What seems to be the hot button as far as maybe any regulatory change or anything like that that's going on in Europe that's affecting the supply chains?
So look, we mentioned Brexit, and that's still a huge issue for us here, but that's almost isolated and maybe irrelevant for this conversation. But what comes up on the programs that we can see as issues and problems is, okay, going back to the Incoterms, we don't need to dwell on the point, but classifying your product and having the right information if you're receiving the product on your commercial invoice. In some cases it's lacking, and so you cannot classify the product correctly. And then having the harmonized system in the US, which is slightly different in the EU tariff database in terms of those last 4 digits on your classification code. So issues seem to be back to classifying your product correctly. Who is doing that for you? You are responsible for doing that yourself. But of course, a lot of times we outsource it, but we have to ensure that it's correct. And then issues around rules of origin, customs valuation.
Well, I think the scenario where you're going, I for our listeners, again, I would have to say, in talking with them, there's one thing to say, all right, country of origin and the proper markings and those kinds of things for your commodities. In the training, if you're here in the U.S. or in Canada or in Mexico, whatever, it's like you're going to get training with the interpretation from that country, right? So looking at, there's going to be similarities, but I would also say it would be wise for somebody to take a course to say, let me look at the COO requirements from a European perspective. Let me look at the classification again from a European perspective versus the U.S. perspective. Let me look at, even the Incoterms. The Incoterms should be somewhat universal, but again, as we're looking at it, to me, the Incoterms is going to tell you how your paperwork should be filled out. Well, what does that mean? One of the things that I will tell you that I challenge our listeners here, your takeaway when you start talking about Incoterms, everybody talks about that, but it's like they get to a certain point of understanding it. But here's the action that people should take. You've got to get your training. The action is based on what you learn in an Incoterm course is going back into your company so that the data flows are accurate. Case in point, from your purchasing department that goes and generates a purchase order for a widget somewhere at some origin factory. And then based on those Incoterms and how should that item be described? What's the classification should be on? And on the Incoterms, how should the bill of lading be done? And you go all the way through, then start looking at your accounting side of your accounts payable. you don't want to pay for any duties and taxes or your broker or your transportation charges unless it's under the appropriate Incoterm on that. Then your accounts receivable. You want to be able to bill your client, but only after you're appropriately able to do so. Well, when does that happen? So those kinds of things, I guess, is where I'm getting at, is that the training that both Lalo and Fiona are offering from a U.S. or from a European perspective, folks, you need to look at this and understand it so that you go through the training, you look at the perspective, and then from there, you got to make a decision. You're not just enhancing your own knowledge. What action should you take within your own company, be it a small company, a big one, or whatever, and make sure that those data flows and that information is accurate? Would you agree with that, Fiona?
100%, exactly. And that's what I love to see, when you can tell that somebody is taking in the theory behind how to go about classifying or how to go negotiating your Incoterms, but being able to apply it to your supply chain flow to optimize from a commercial point of view, to optimize your business. Amazing. Yeah.
I love it. Well, I know you and I had talked a lot too, aside from what you and Lalo are, obviously you're phenomenal in your expertise as far as training. But I mean, you and I were talking, I guess, from a business perspective, and I was, throwing you some ideas as far as marketing and reaching out and those kinds of things. Not that I have any expertise on that. I was just trying to give you a few ideas. But I guess in looking at that, what are you doing now as far as your company growing, and what's your future look like for your company?
Oh, no, thanks a million. And by the way, Andy, I'll never forget that moment where we had this pop-up stand, those pull-ups, and all we had was like ITI all over it. And you're like, that doesn't give me anything. Like, you need to be. And so it was.
Yep.
And so
it's like, anyway, what do you do? I don't know what ITI is. It was like,
I know. Like, that was so useful, so useful. Anyway, what we're doing is we're now able to attend conferences. It's brilliant. It's great to get out and about and actually meet people and more importantly, like, listen to people and how can we be useful? How can we be useful to you, to your company, or to you like professionally, to help you grow and back to your point, actually, Andy, about how to optimize your business in terms of like what you learn on these training courses, because we can all go on training courses and press play and go away and make a cup of coffee, and then you don't actually. But this is like, it's practical. It's building your knowledge network. It's building your professional network, and so yeah. So we're trying to basically just be part of more conversations and listen to those that are involved in this. There's so many experts, like even in those that have graduated from our program. I look at this list and go, my gosh, like you can phone them up anytime, and they're so helpful. And there's a lovely way, even at those ICPA events and like I mentioned, those various LinkedIn groups. There's a nice camaraderie amongst trade compliance professionals that try to help each other, and that's what we're trying to do. So we're trying to get out a little bit more and talk and listen to more people.
What would be, from your perspective, Fiona, as we're trying to wrap things up here, is there anything in particular that you want to emphasize to anybody here in the U.S. that's looking to get some additional training, or others there in the in the EU? We've got several listeners around the world here, so what would you like to emphasize as far as what you've got going here?
Yeah, no, thanks. And I'm one of those listeners too. I put my earphones in when I go out for my walk in the evening time and listen to your previous podcast. It's so useful. I always go by, like, it's one thing for me to say, come and do our training course, this training course, but like, it's going back to those that have already completed it, and you can see that they have enhanced their knowledge, enhanced their skills, their network, and their confidence. That comes through all the time. Like one person said to me, my confidence has been transformed in my job, and that's so lovely to hear, because that's what you want. You want to be able to be useful to somebody and be helpful to their professional development. And with regards to like the US and the EU, it's to have that kind of two-way conversation that's going, right, this is where I struggle over here in the US to understand the EU point of view, and this is where I struggle over here in the EU to understand the US point of view, and just have that two-way conversation going to help to just help enhance what you're doing on a day-to-day.
All right, I'm going to throw a question, a final question, I guess, towards Lalo and yourself. So, Lalo, from your perspective, what would be probably the two most important training? I'm putting Lalo on the spot. I'm putting you on the spot too. I get it. But as far as training goes, and you've got a lot of folks out here that are somewhat rookies. You got a lot of senior people that probably need, to go back through the basics sometimes. What would be the two most important training classes that you think somebody, if they were going to prioritize something, that they ought to look at from a U.S. perspective?
I know being 2024 and a new year, and let's get a fresh start, and what should we do to make everything great, get off on the right foot. I know the two that I always tell everyone that they should always start with is, number one is trade compliance. I'm sorry, is tariff classification. That is like the foundation for everything, meaning you cannot do free trade agreements if you don't understand the tariff. You know what I mean? And you cannot, like when you're exporting and you have export licenses and you don't classify your products correctly, that goes into the ECCNs, that goes into trade. I mean, it's the foundation, in my opinion, for everything. So I always tell everybody, if you're going to just get started, why don't you just start with the tariff classification class? And from there, then we go off and we ask, okay, so what is your concentration, importing or exporting? Is it just generally overseeing everything? And so from there, then we can pick any number of other ones, like our importing class or our exporting class or our logistics class. We have a logistics and international shipping class as well. So it depends on what you're going to go into, but I always feel the tariff class is the best one to take just to understand the foundation of trade overall.
Okay. Fiona, what about you?
Yeah, so there's a class called Customs for Business, which I think is brilliant, because what it does is introduces the concept of customs to that individual or that company, and then it introduces the idea a little bit about customs classification, tariff classification, a little bit about valuation, a little bit about origin. So it kind of gives you an overview before you commit to taking a full class on each of those pillars of customs.
All right, so that particular course would be open just about anybody that, if you're in a company that deals with international transactions of any kind, imports, exports, or whatever, or you're considering it, that would be a good course to take as far as an introductory type thing, wouldn't it?
I think so, because it also touches on that customs declaration and those 44 or 50 boxes that you need to complete. Not that you will be completing it, but just so you have a little better understanding about what happens what feeds in that information into that customs declaration.
Right. And do you have a second top course?
So what we started to do master classes this year, which was kind of like little bite-sized information sessions. And one that came back as being like very, very popular was prepare for a customs audit. And what that did was kind of similar to that Customs for Business, but it just focused in on, oh my gosh, this is coming up, and people start to panic, but don't panic. Here's what you need to know. And again, it's like, your SOPs and your paper trail, your paperwork, and then of course your declarations and how to classify your products, valuation and origin, and Incoterms.
There he goes. Folks, I got to tell you, this has been a great discussion. We could probably keep going and whatnot. I hope you have found this to be of interest. But, actually, kind of both you and Lalo both, Fiona, have been great on this one. I will say they kind of turned the tables on you, Lalo, a little bit. But on this, I will say, Fiona, thank you for being on our show. By the way, how's your daughter doing? It's like she called during the conference, and obviously.
Stop. Do you know what? That was such a lovely moment. And sorry, I don't want to take up time here, but it was so lovely when she FaceTimed me and I was able to go around to everybody. And that was another really nice aspect of getting together and you're getting to know each other. She's great. She's just home from school. Happy out. Thank you.
Tell her hello and whatnot. It's like it was such an honor and privilege to get to say hi, and I appreciated you sharing the phone call, and that was a lot of fun. So we laughed about that. So that was good.
Excellent. It was brilliant.
Well, thank you so much. Actually, Lalo, appreciate you, my friend. Any last words from you?
No, I'm good. I just want to thank Fiona for coming on, and I know it's late for you, and we're coming on a weekend. So thank you for joining us.
No, not at all. My pleasure. Thanks a million for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.